Vladimir Tismanianu's The Devil in History, Communism, Fascism, and Some Lessons of the 20th Century is a compelling and ambitious exploration of the ideological totalitarianism that shaped the 20th century. The book offers a comparative analysis of communism and fascism, arguing that both represent radical revolutionary movements that sought to reconstruct society based on ideological purity and the negation of individual liberty. Tismanianu, a political scientist with expertise in totalitarian regimes, examines the intellectual foundations, historical trajectories, and legacies of these two systems, while considering their broader implications for modern political thought. This essay will explore the key arguments of The Devil in History, focusing on Tismanianu's central thesis, his comparative framework, and the broader lessons he draws from the 20th century totalitarian experience. 1. The central thesis, the totalitarian mindset. At the heart of Tismanianu's work is the assertion that both communism and fascism stem from a similar ideological mindset, one that views history as a battleground for absolute truths, rejects liberal democracy as weak and decadent, and embraces violence as a means of achieving utopian goals. He does not argue that communism and fascism are identical, but rather that they share core characteristics that justify studying them in parallel. One of the book's central insights is the concept of the devil in history, the notion that political ideologies, when elevated to absolute doctrines, can lead to moral blindness, justifying mass violence and repression in the name of a supposed higher good. Tismanianu argues that both Stalinist communism and Nazi fascism shared a commitment to the transformation of humanity through ideological purification. They sought to create new societies by eradicating perceived enemies. For the Nazis, this was defined racially, while for the communists it was defined in terms of class struggle. This approach challenges the common perception that communism, despite its atrocities, was fundamentally more humane than fascism. Tismanianu critiques the tendency among some Western intellectuals to downplay the crimes of communism while treating fascism as the ultimate evil. He insists that both ideologies resulted in unprecedented human suffering and should be understood as part of the same totalitarian impulse. 2. Communism and Fascism, a Comparative Perspective. Tismanianu systematically compares communism and fascism across several dimensions, including their ideological foundations, political structures, use of terror, and methods of social control. 2.1. Ideological Foundations. Both communism and fascism were radical departures from classical liberalism. Communism, rooted in Marxism-Leninism, saw history as a class struggle culminating in a proletarian revolution that would lead to a stateless, classless society. Fascism, on the other hand, rejected class struggle in favor of national and racial unity, emphasizing the supremacy of the state, militarism, and the necessity of a strong, charismatic leader. Despite these differences, both ideologies rejected individual rights, democracy, and pluralism. They promoted the idea of an all-encompassing ideology that dictated truth and sought to reshape human consciousness through propaganda, education, and state control. 2.2. Political Structures and Terror. Both regimes established centralized, authoritarian states that relied on mass mobilization, secret police, and political repression. The Soviet Union under Stalin and Nazi Germany under Hitler operated through extensive surveillance, mass purges, and concentration camps. Tismanianu highlights how both regimes used show trials, forced confessions, and executions to eliminate perceived enemies. One striking parallel he draws is between the Stalinist purges and the Nazi Night of the Long Knives. Both leaders consolidated power by targeting not only external enemies, but also members of their own political movements. This self-consuming violence was a hallmark of totalitarian politics, demonstrating the paranoia inherent in ideological purity. The use of violence and the justification of atrocities. One of the book's most unsettling themes is the role of violence in totalitarian ideology. Both communism and fascism justified mass killing as a means to achieve a higher historical purpose. Stalinism rationalized the Gulag system and forced collectivization as necessary sacrifices for the socialist future, while Nazism framed the Holocaust as essential for racial purity. Tismanianu argues that totalitarian regimes are unique in their ability to turn mass murder into a bureaucratic process. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt described it, is evident in both the Soviet and Nazi apparatuses, where bureaucrats rather than fanatical ideologues, often administered terror. Lessons for the present: the persistence of totalitarian thinking. While The Devil in History is primarily a historical analysis, Tismanianu also reflects on the implications of totalitarianism for the modern world. He warns against the resurgence of ideological extremism in various forms and critiques the lingering sympathies for communist thought in some academic and political circles. The 3.1, the problem of selective memory. One of Tismanianu's key concerns is the way history is remembered and interpreted. While Nazi crimes are universally condemned, communist crimes have often been relativized or excused. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to widespread recognition of its failures, but there remains, in some intellectual circles, a tendency to romanticize communist ideals. Tismanianu calls for an honest reckoning with history, arguing that societies must acknowledge the full scope of totalitarian crimes. He supports efforts to educate the public about the horrors of both fascism and communism, emphasizing that selective memory only enables future extremism. 3.2. The dangers of utopian thinking. Another important lesson from the book is the danger of utopian political thinking. Both communism and fascism promised a perfect society, but demanded absolute obedience and ruthless violence to achieve it. Tismanianu warns that any ideology claiming to possess a monopoly on truth and moral authority can lead to authoritarian tendencies. In today's political climate, he argues, it is crucial to remain vigilant against movements that reject democratic institutions, suppress dissent, or seek to impose rigid ideological conformity. The 20th century showed that utopian dreams, when combined with unchecked power, can produce nightmares. 3.3. The role of intellectuals and ideology. Tismanianu also critiques the role of intellectuals in legitimizing totalitarian ideologies. He notes that many Western thinkers supported communism despite its atrocities, often dismissing evidence of repression as Western propaganda. This phenomenon, he suggests, reflects a broader tendency among intellectuals to be seduced by radical ideas that promise justice but deliver tyranny. By examining the intellectual origins of totalitarianism, Tismanianu challenges readers to be more skeptical of ideological dogmas, whether from the left or the right. He advocates for a commitment to democratic pluralism, open debate, and individual freedom as safeguards against totalitarian thinking. Vladimir Tismanianu's The Devil in History is a profound meditation on the nature of totalitarianism and its enduring lessons for contemporary politics. Through a rigorous comparison of communism and fascism, he exposes their shared ideological roots, methods of repression, and justifications for violence. The book serves as both a historical analysis and a warning against the dangers of utopian thinking. Tismanianu reminds us that the desire to create a perfect world, when pursued through absolute ideological certainty, can lead to unimaginable horrors. Ultimately, The Devil in History calls for a commitment to historical truth, intellectual humility, and democratic values. By understanding the past, we can better safeguard against the reemergence of totalitarian tendencies in the present.